people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Canelo Alvarez versus Dimitri Bivol. Let's talk about the fight. Yesterday, Canelo Alvarez ventured north of the super middleweight division where most other fighters dare not venture, dare not go. Not unless they have to, because at 175 pounds, what you have is a lot of capable boxers with not a lot of marquee value. That is the best way to describe the light heavyweight division. Canelo Alvarez being the cash cow of boxing himself.
Whatever he does generates money and generates interest.
He was, unlike many others, willing to test his mettle, test his luck, try it at 175 pounds, and it backfired. Canelo Alvarez hit a wall. When this fight was first announced,
Canelo Alvarez had a lot of options.
the option to take on Errol Spence Jr., Jermall Charlo, or David Benavidez. I myself identified Dimitri Bivol in a fight with him as a bigger potential banana skin than any of those fights, because this guy's a light heavyweight champion, an unbeaten one, who's in his prime, with a base style that doesn't really do Canelo's base style any favors. At minimum, I felt Canelo's really going to have to work for the W with this guy.
Well, I, like many of you out there, thought he could pull it off, and he didn't.
That's unfortunate, but that is an occupational hazard in the sport. Sometimes you hit a wall.
That's what happened last night to Canelo.
Based on what I saw last night, he did. Based on what I saw last night, if anyone other than Canelo Alvarez himself,
Any of these other guys at 154, 160, or 168.
if they were to venture north of the super middleweight division into no man's land, into the light heavyweight division, unfamiliar, uncharted territory, if they were to do this and share the same ring with the same Dimitri Bivol that Canelo Alvarez just fought, they don't finish the fight with him on their feet.
Yeah, I think Dimitri would knock a lot of those guys out.
Dimitri, who I had winning this fight 7 rounds to 5.
Against a very flat Canelo Alvarez who came up short in a lot of areas.
You won't fight any convoluted rationale here. Put simply, Canelo Alvarez couldn't put a dent in this guy, and because he couldn't put a dent in this guy, he couldn't wear him down.
And he couldn't wear him out the way he did Billy Joe Saunders.
The way he did Caleb Plant. He couldn't assert himself against Dimitri Bivol, not fully. Couldn't get his respect.
Couldn't wear down his defenses.
This fight, we saw that Dimitri Bivol was very in and out whilst being very durable.
What shots got through for Canelo Alvarez had no effect on Dimitri Bivol.
And that's more important than people think. The fact that Canelo Alvarez just couldn't put a dent in this guy. What punches actually got through for him, what hooks sailed around the guard, what uppercuts split it.
None of that stuff was able to put a dent in Dimitri because he's the naturally bigger guy.
That's accustomed to dealing with naturally bigger guys, much bigger guys than a Canelo Alvarez. Skilled boxer that he might be, size matters. Don't let anybody tell you different.
You could see how much it mattered whenever it was Dimitri that let his hands go.
I didn't like how the otherwise durable Canelo Alvarez was receiving those shots, even the ones that didn't get through the guard. Even the shots that he blocked seemed to be heavy shots, or at least heavy shots for him as a naturally smaller fighter attempting to campaign as a light heavyweight. This was his second attempt.
His first attempt at becoming a champion at this weight was against Sergey.
With Dimitri Bivol last night for the WBA light heavyweight title, he attempted to achieve that for a second time and came up short of answers in every department. Canelo Alvarez is normally a quick fighter, a fast fighter with fast counters, but so is Dimitri Bivol. Canelo Alvarez is normally a durable fighter that can take a good punch, can take what shots get through. But you know what? The same is true of Dimitri Bivol. He's just a naturally bigger guy. Put simply, a good big man.
A good big man beats a good little man.
Contrary to the opinions of Canelo Alvarez's critics, who are now celebrating his latest defeat, though I don't know why, seeing as they didn't think Dimitri Bivol was very good to begin with, whereas here on the channel, Dimitri was identified as the biggest potential banana skin.
Out of all the guys Canelo Alvarez could have chose to fight, this is the most dangerous guy.
This is the more difficult fight.
Yeah, this guy's no pushover.
Between Dimitri Bivol's natural size and the advantage that gave him over Canelo Alvarez, the durability that comes with it, his quickness in his movement, and his very neat and tidy textbook style.
He's always been defensively responsible. That's one of Dimitri's standout qualities.
What Canelo Alvarez had in front of him was a naturally bigger guy who's durable enough to take what shots get through, but still defensively responsible enough to minimize
the limit how many punches Canelo lands.
What resonates with me most post-fight is that Canelo Alvarez was unable to wear Dimitri Bivol down, was unable to wear Dimitri Bivol out.
You're going to get a lot of bold takes from a lot of people.
I've even seen some people call Canelo Alvarez a bum.
He's a bum for losing to a naturally bigger guy who's a light heavyweight champion.
As if taking on a light heavyweight champion in your fourth weight class is something to sneeze at. Better still, you're going to get a lot of bold takes from a lot of people, and this is mine. Canelo Alvarez don't belong at light heavyweight. It proved too high a mountain to climb.
That's all it was. He can't wear guys down and wear guys out at 175.
He just didn't have the same thudding power that he has as a super middleweight. And why would he? These aren't super middleweights he'd be fighting at light heavyweight. Wasn't a super middleweight in front of him last night. He didn't have the same thudding power. His speed was there for a while, though I think what shots got through for Dimitri actually wore down Canelo.
That took something out of him.
Took something off his power, took something off his speed.
Some might come to the conclusion that the added weight is what affected Canelo.
And the vegan diet, we've had those conversations in passing, though I think what really took something off of Canelo Alvarez in this fight was whenever Dimitri Bivol did let his hands go. You saw that Canelo Alvarez ain't taking these punches as well as he takes punches from a super middleweight, that these shots, they look like heavy shots.
Dimitri has good power, but he's not known as a big puncher.
Punches looked decent sized against Canelo Alvarez last night, who looked very much a fish out of water, a naturally smaller guy who's struggling to stay in character.
My thoughts on last night's fight, Canelo Alvarez don't need to venture north of 168.
He bit off more than he could chew. There's no other way for me to put it. He don't belong up there with those light heavyweights. He just ain't got the same size and durability they's got up there.
Good big man beats a good little man. That's the easiest way to put it.
And in spite of what toxic boxing fans are out there attempting to shame Canelo Alvarez for this ambitious endeavor, I myself don't think there's any shame in that. This was Canelo Alvarez's fourth weight after all. In terms of physical dimensions, Canelo Alvarez never had the biggest physical dimensions or the most generous for a middleweight or a super middleweight, let alone a light heavyweight. So what we saw last night is Canelo Alvarez hitting a wall. The right man won the fight. I had Dimitri Bivol winning this thing 7 rounds to 5. There were rounds where you saw that Canelo Alvarez was a bit busier than Dimitri. Not because Dimitri was hurt, not because Dimitri was gassing out. I got the sense that what Dimitri was doing was looking for Canelo to blow his load so he can pour it on the next round. And those were really the rounds I gave Canelo Alvarez.
It looked like Dimitri was going to let Canelo Alvarez throw.
He's letting him throw so he could punch himself out. And once he does, Dimitri would come on strong afterwards, try to land a phono finish punch. And I will say that if that were any other guy than Canelo Alvarez, that guy gets stopped.
Any other middleweight or any other super middleweight.
That guy gets stopped. If Canelo Alvarez didn't, it's because, well, he is an above-average fighter at those weights. He is an above-average super middleweight, well above average, but he loses something on the way up. He loses something en route to light heavyweight, and he found that out last night. He found that out the hard way.
Is this the beginning of the end for Canelo Alvarez? Because he's still the super middleweight division's undisputed champion.
Could this be the beginning of a downward spiral for Canelo Alvarez? I really do think that depends on what happens next, what move he makes. Post-fight, CompuBox's Dan Canobio asked, where does Canelo Alvarez go from here? And there are already talks of a second fight. There are already talks of a rematch, though in terms of where I think Canelo should go, I think he should go back down to 168. I think he found out the hard way that he just doesn't have the size to contend with the big boys.
You know, he wasn't marked up after the fight.
Defensive prowess held up enough that he wasn't ragdolled by Dimitri Bivol, though he was out-hustled.
In terms of offense, he was out-muscled.
Certainly couldn't overpower Dimitri, couldn't necessarily get his respect.
But he wasn't a bloody mess afterwards either.
Canelo Alvarez himself stated, I'm not giving any excuses. I did feel I won that fight. I think perhaps I lost 4 or 5 rounds, but I definitely didn't lose the fight. Maybe the weight was a slight issue and made me feel not 100%.
He lost the fucking fight.
9-3 on some cards, 8-4 on others, 7-5 on mine.
He lost.
All the same, Canelo Alvarez didn't win that fight.
Let's make that crystal clear.
Even on the judges' scorecards, which I myself attempted to forecast live during the fight, I figured the judges have got Dimitri Bivol up, but these same judges are going to look for rounds to give Canelo Alvarez, and they're going to look hard. They're going to be generous. Such is the case.
Don't forget, this guy won 114 Floyd Mayweather.
I was right to assume that judges are going to look hard for rounds to give Canelo Alvarez, and in many ways, they did. You see their scorecards.
Even with that, Canelo Alvarez was losing. The right man won the fight.
Canelo Alvarez, who says, this doesn't end this way. I'm a very competitive person. I've got many years ahead of me, and I'm going to come back stronger. We want the rematch, and we want to do much better in the rematch. I'm very proud and very competitive. I've gone up and fought at 175 pounds. I've gone out of my comfort zone to fight at a weight that's not mine. There's no shame in that. I'm looking for challenges that others would be scared to take on because they might lose.
And that much I agree with. I don't think for a second Canelo Alvarez won this fight.
I want to make that crystal clear, but I do think that in Canelo Alvarez venturing north of 168 pounds to take on the likes of a Dimitri Bivol, he's doing something that most other fighters wouldn't do. Case in point, David Benavidez.
How long has that guy been killing himself to make super middleweight?
And how much longer is he going to keep doing it? He's already lost his title on the scales once. He seems to be busting at the seams, sitting in the kiddie pool, having a much bigger frame than the likes of a Canelo Alvarez. I mean, this is clearly a guy who needs to move up in weight, but according to David, he insists on staying at 168 pounds because he dare not venture.
He can explain it away and decorate it however he likes.
You can too, but the fact of the matter is, moving up in weight at this point would do more for David's career and his profile than staying at 168 pounds and fighting David Lemieux.
What the hell's that going to do for him?
The difference between Canelo and these other guys is that Canelo didn't have to fight Dimitri Bivol. He wanted to. He didn't need to take on an unbeaten champion at a higher weight.
He did so voluntarily.
When are we going to see that kind of gusto from David? David Benavidez, who has a much bigger frame than a Canelo Alvarez does comparatively. When are we going to see that kind of gusto from Jermall Charlo, who seems quite content fighting everyone else's leftovers?
He fought Sergey, who's Danny Jacobs and Gennady Golovkin's leftovers.
He's fighting Sulietsky in his next fight, who's already beaten by Demetrius Andrade and Danny Jacobs.
All these other guys are doing are fighting everybody else's leftovers.
That's what Jermall is doing. That's what David's doing. While their fans and their supporters, what little supporters they might have, while they celebrate things going sideways for Canelo Alvarez last night, the fighters they support don't exhibit that same ambition, which begs the question, why do you even support them?
There's no shame in Canelo Alvarez losing to Dimitri Bivol last night.
There's no shame in that, but the real shame is if Canelo Alvarez himself doesn't read the writing on the wall, if he doesn't get the message, the memo. He's too small for light heavyweight. There were moments where he was attempting to set traps for Dimitri Bivol by laying on the ropes, looking to set up a big counter. And Dimitri, he was astute enough that he didn't take the bait.
He knew Canelo was trying to set him up.
Even worse is that had those traps he set been successful and he got off a clean shot on Dimitri, you see Dimitri was able to deal with his power. You see Dimitri was durable enough that when shots get through, they're not bothering him.
Look.
Far be it from me to pander to anybody's fan base and tell them things that they want to hear, whispering sweet nothings in their ear. I don't do that. I'm not in the business of doing that. Though if you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, Canelo Alvarez amassed the following that he amassed by fighting in the fights that people wanted to see. A fight just like last night's fight. A dangerous fight where there's a chance that things go sideways for Canelo.
They did.
And they did.
But Canelo's fans aren't his fans because he has an unbeaten record.
He doesn't have an unbeaten record. That cherry got popped a long time ago when he was 23 years old and he took on Floyd Mayweather Jr. If he were in the business of stat padding and protecting his own, he wouldn't have fought the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the sport at 23. For Christ's sakes, look at Gervonta Davis.
23 years old, they wouldn't let that kid park his car next to Vasyl Lomachenko, much less fight him.
Canelo's supporters and Canelo's fans aren't his fans because he's got an unblemished record. No, he popped that cherry a long time ago. He's already lost once and he suffered his second loss last night, but they're not his fans because he's got a perfect record.
They're his fans because he fights in fights that people want to see.
Allow me to impart an inconvenient truth to all of you. Canelo Alvarez has a lot of supporters all around the world from different places, different races, different people. But here in America,
it's those Chicano fans that love him most of all.
You know, I know that Canelo has a lot of different fans that hail from a lot of different places and different races and all that jazz. But here in America, it really is those Mexican fight fans that have helped make him the cash cow of boxing in this era. And one thing that always rings true of the Mexican fight fans is they don't care about an unblemished record. They just care about seeing a good fight and supporting a guy that's willing to put one on. So this loss that Canelo Alvarez suffered yesterday,
it's a setback. It's definitely a setback.
but it doesn't have to be the end of the world, and it doesn't have to be the end of Canelo. It all depends on what he decides to do moving forward. Does he actually go through with a rematch?
Does he?
Does he actually fight Dimitri Bivol at light heavyweight for a second time? Or does he just wash his hands of the situation altogether and move forward with what was the proposed Gennady Golovkin trilogy? I think he stands a better chance of beating Gennady in a trilogy than he does of beating Bivol in a rematch. I think he found out the hard way that the light heavyweight division, perhaps he's biting off more than he can chew up there. All he's got to do now is realize that, put his pride to the side, and get himself back in the winner's bracket, because a trilogy with Gennady Golovkin now has an added element of spontaneity that wasn't there before. Canelo Alvarez has been reminded that he's only human.
Cash cow of boxing.
Pound for pound fighter or not, you win some, you lose some. You pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and get back on the saddle.
Re-strategize, refocus, and pick your battles.
I don't actually like Canelo's chances in a second fight. I don't like his chances in a rematch. There's a grim possibility that he could get stopped the second time out, because now Dimitri Bivol knows something about Canelo that he didn't know before. He now knows Canelo can't hurt him.
He can't make a dent on this guy.
Canelo Alvarez's defensive prowess and his boxing acumen was good enough that post-fight he wasn't a bloody mess. He wasn't particularly marked up after the fight.
He didn't take very many clean punches, and he didn't take a whole lot of punishment.
Though he was demoralized. He came up short in a lot of other areas, to where he couldn't stay in character. He couldn't be the guy at 175 that he is at 168. So the focus should be getting back down to 168, getting back in the winner's bracket.
He'll live to fight another day.
There's no shame in Canelo Alvarez's ambition to try and pry away the WBA title from Dimitri Bivol. There's no shame in failure, because sometimes in failure, sometimes in defeat, you learn more than you do in victory.
Canelo Alvarez seemed all but invincible as a super middleweight.
But at light heavyweight, it's a different ballgame. It's going to take more than what we've been seeing, and perhaps it's more than anyone can ask for of Canelo Alvarez.
Hey, I say it all the time. If winning a belt at 175 pounds is so fucking easy, let's see Jermall Charlo do it.
Let's see David Benavidez do it, because if you didn't know who Dimitri Bivol was before, certainly you've got to know who he is now. He just beat Canelo Alvarez. His stock is on the up.
And up.
He's certainly a bigger name now than the guys that David Benavidez and Jermall Charlo have been fighting, and the guys they're about to fight. Dimitri Bivol, and his name is a bigger name now than the name of David Lemieux, than the name of Maciej Suliecki, so it goes without saying that there's actually an incentive now to go up there and try to outdo Canelo Alvarez.
You got people trashing Canelo Alvarez for losing to this guy, but if it's easy, show us.
Because at the end of the day, I'm a boxing fan. I'm just a boxing fan that wants to see boxing matches. And if you tough critics out there think David Benavidez can move up there and do better than Canelo, let's have it.
I buy that for $1.
You really think that Demetrius and Jermall and David can move up to light heavyweight and succeed where Canelo Alvarez failed? By all rights, make the fight.